What if you took massive action and changed it all up for tiny house living? What would the implications be if you're a 50 pluser Gen Xer in the midst of a mid career crisis? That's what we're going to take a look at in today's video. Hi, I'm Jeanette, the Northbound Coach, and I'm so glad that you've joined me on my channel today. Last week, I reflected on the question of, could there be a connection between an interest in tiny house living and mid-career crisis? And that was brought on by, my pandemic and, well, actually, in all honesty, continuing interest in the tiny house living. And I was just curious about if there's some sort of a connection there between this life stage and this interest in tiny houses, even though in reality, my lifestyle is far from tiny house living. So, seems like I'm not the only one wondering about that. I had good interest in the topic. And so I wanted to do a little bit of a deeper reflection today on what would it mean? Like, what if we really did kind of go beyond the casual interest in this topic and implemented this sort of change in our life? What benefits might we expect from tiny house living relative to the mid-career crisis? So that's what we're going to talk about. And the first thing that I guess is the most obvious one, at least from the way that my brain is thinking, is a financial benefit. So clearly, a tiny house relative to the cost of other housing options is potentially a cheaper option. So much so that I think a number of people in the tiny house community talk about being able to essentially take care of that cost. So there is no mortgage and there is no rent. And so without those financial burdens, that opens up a lot more possibility and freedom from no longer having that as part of the monthly budget. So that's a big financial implication of the tiny house movement. I think the other thing that goes right hand in hand with that is the idea that, of course, in a tiny house, you have fewer objects. So there are fewer things to have to maintain, fewer things get broken, fewer things need to have space to store them, et cetera, et cetera. And just the obvious things around utilities and so forth would be less expensive. And so altogether, that's a package of a greater sense of freedom, allowing maybe more choices in the mid-career space. So, maybe you don't have to go for the high salary position. Maybe that gives you some options to get closer to some of the work that would be most fulfilling at this particular stage. So that's a big one. Now, I think the second category, I'm going to call it stress reduction. So the idea is in a decluttered space, there could be less stress. Now, I do, in all authenticity, need to tell you that I don't think that reduced stress would come immediately, at least not for me. I think if I were to make this sort of a change, I might have a period of increased stress because I find that thought of getting through the actual decluttering process to be quite emotionally draining. I mean, yeah, it's actually physically draining because you're actually moving objects around and figuring out what to do with them, but it's also emotional to go through that process. Well, at least for me, others may feel differently, but those others probably are already generally decluttered. So there would be a hurdle to get to this state of reduced stress. But I do see that on the other side of it, living with less clutter, I think I mentioned in last week's video, like, do we really need 8 spatulas? Well, living with just one spatula, your favorite spatula, your prioritized spatula, would lead to a sense of less stress. At least that's how I'm looking at it at this point. Because I think the decluttering process would help in the prioritization. So, first, the prioritization around material objects, but in that journey, I think it's a prioritization around some of that mental and emotional space, really getting to what matters most to us at this particular stage of life. Which leads me to the third concept of the benefits of actually going from dreaming about this to doing it would be a sense of fulfillment. It would come from going against the grain, right? This is not a societal norm to go from, building, 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 and then, oh, go tiny. Most time the expectation is you're building, building, building to go big. So this goes against the grain, but I think in that process, it really shakes things up. And so I could see that this would really open up with much more freedom, next stage of really thinking about what matters most and thinking outside of the box about, what some of those alternatives might be. And of course, that applies to the career options as well. The final thing I think that I don't think it's final in terms of the list of things. I'm sure there's many, many more on there. But the final thing that comes to mind that I want to talk about today that could lead to greater fulfillment is just that sense of belonging and community. I get a sense from the videos that I've watched about people moving into tiny house living that some of them, at least, move into that in tiny house communities. So they're with other people who have made similar choices, and those bonds can be really rewarding and reinforcing at this particular juncture. And so that's another, I think, appealing aspect of it. What do you think? I'm curious about like how serious could you be at this point on this topic? I'm not here to sell you a tiny house. I have no vested interest in tiny house living, but I just think it's a very interesting alternative as we think about making choices at this point in our career. Thanks for joining me today. I come twice a week with videos on topics related to mid-career crisis, Gen X living, and I'm so happy to have you join me. Please like and subscribe, and we will see you back again in a couple of days.